Should I go ahead? All right. Okay, so it is live. For events, but without further ado, oh, I should introduce myself. I forgot. I always forget about that. For events. My name is Mehmet Küçüközer.
Oh, I should introduce myself. I forgot. I always forget about that.
Sorry, I have to mute the other page. So my name is Mehmet Küçüközer. I am associate professor of sociology at Dutchess Community College, and I'm also the chair of Hispanic Heritage Month. And so today, Gladys Aponte will give a talk. The title of her talk is Latinx Language and Raciolinguistic Ideologies. And again, Gladys Aponte is a researcher and doctoral candidate at the City University of New York Graduate Center in the field of urban ed, correct? Urban education?
Yes.
And so she'll be giving some insight from the research that she's doing for her dissertation. So Gladys, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mehmet. Let me just share my screen here. And all right, well, as Mehmet said, I am Gladys Aponte. I'm a Dominican New Yorker. I was born in what's today considered New York City, which is the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people. My parents are from Quisqueya, what is today known as the Dominican Republic. I'm a PhD student in urban education, but prior to pursuing my doctoral degree, I was a fourth grade bilingual teacher. So a lot of what I share today comes from that experience, as well as being now a teacher educator for the last few years, working with teachers across New York City in different bilingual and ESL settings. So before I share some of my work and my research, I wanted to engage you all in a few reflective questions to self-reflect. Some questions that are relevant to what we'll be speaking about today. These are 3 questions. I'll give you a minute to think about them. What assumptions do you think people make about you before they hear you speak? What assumptions do you think people make about you when they hear your accent? And FYI, we all have an accent. What assumptions do you think people make about you after they find out your cultural and/or ancestral background? So take a minute to think about these assumptions that you think people make about you, and feel free to write them in the chat, and then we'll share some they come in. And to add to that, as you're thinking of these assumptions, think about how you might benefit from some of these assumptions, and how do some of these assumptions work to marginalize you or further marginalize you.
So Gladys, in the absence of if there are absence of comments or questions, and if you feel you want to direct any of these towards me, feel free.
Sure, Mehmet, if you want to share, can you share any assumptions, any of these questions you're thinking of, if anything comes to mind?
Actually, I do have one, actually a student of mine has already asked some questions. So I think one assumption that she faces, Emily McNamara points out that perhaps people think about her as, question, does she have a college education? She thinks about another question that comes to mind about what people are assuming, how can perhaps they benefit from her company? So the idea of maybe there's a transactional relationship model here, right? They're thinking about how people can benefit from other people's company. Of course, they make assumptions about people's levels of education.
Definitely.
Samantha Cruz writes, many people don't know that she's Mexican because she's very pale, she says, and white, but both my parents are Mexican, and once people find out I don't have white parents, they definitely treat her differently, when she doesn't have white parents. she noticed that people begin to treat her differently. So the assumption that they immediately make that she's not of Mexican descent or Mexican origin.
Yeah.
And then when they do find out a different treatment, another commenter here writes, Dutchess 3, I don't know who that is, of course. As a non-native speaker of Spanish, I get, you don't look like someone who could speak Spanish, that this person writes. So immediately assumption, perhaps of that someone who speaks Spanish is somebody who is racially or ethnically looks distinctive, right?
Right.
So there are expectations about appearance there about people who speak Spanish. Good, all right.
Great.
Comments?
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. And this is exactly what we're talking about today. So we'll definitely jump into those themes, those topics today. So I'm excited to share a bit about the research I'm doing, the work I'm doing. But before I do that, I wanted to before I jump into that, I want to take a moment to talk about what Hispanic Heritage Month means and how it can be problematic, given that it's really a celebration of Spanish conquest and erases our Africanness and our indigeneity. So this is a learning space. We're all lifelong learners, and I wanted to call us in and think about, well, what does it mean to have this month celebrating Hispanic heritage? When people are celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, what they're really celebrating is a colonial history that isn't just history, it's also a lived reality for many people across this continent. So I think it's important to ask ourselves, like, what makes some Indigenous and African descendants on this continent Hispanic? And what is it? Is it that our ancestors were forced to speak Spanish? And with that, our original languages and cultures forcibly erased? Is it that the slavery that was brought on by Spaniards and other Europeans? Are we celebrating the genocide, the enslavement, and the rape of our Black and Brown ancestors? And how does it get more complicated today as we become more conscious? This is a continent that was ravished by European colonization and is now the so-called Americas, named after a European colonizer, right? But many Indigenous people call this continent Abya Yala or Turtle Island. And when I say this continent, this includes North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean, which is often overlooked, even though ironically, that's where colonization of this continent began in the first place, right, in the Caribbean. I also want to point out the flyer, how are flyers like this one that I see commonly floating around during Hispanic Heritage Month, seen here at the bottom left, that have the colors of the flag of Spain, which is a European nation. How is that representative of us here in this continent? And representative of those here who are Indigenous, mixed Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, right, etc. Do we want to continue to use labels like Latino, Latina, Latinx, or Hispanic, when these labels were forced on us by Europeans as a way to assimilate to the dominant European settler society? So that's why I tend to put Latinx and all that, even in the title of this talk, and put in quotations. And I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about this, visiting Professor Silali Anahuac's YouTube channel and Instagram pages called Mexican Excellence. You can see that at the bottom right. She talks a lot about this there. And she also explains it in her book, Don't Call Me Latina. I learned a lot about this topic from her. The process of decolonizing is a continuous journey, of course. I'm sharing from my current perspective, but it's an ongoing process to approach things from a critical perspective, right? To unlearn things that we've learned in a racist, heteronormative, colonial, patriarchal, capitalist society. So I forefront my presentation with all of this to keep us thinking critically about all of these topics in hopes of making positive change. In my work, I look at language and how we've inherited white supremacist language standards and how, unfortunately, we hold ourselves and one another to these white supremacist language standards. One example of this is that we have internalized colonization so much that we judge ourselves and each other based on how well we speak the colonizer's language, right? Based on how well we speak Spanish. In other words, based on the proximity to whiteness. Let's note that the language practices that are given prestige and that are considered quote unquote correct or standard, these are language practices generally ascribed to a white dominant group, right? White middle class people. And this works the same way in the US with English and for quote unquote Latinos with the Spanish language. So the hierarchies of Spanish varieties among the Spanish speaking world, ideas like, for example, that Colombians speak better Spanish and Dominicans don't speak Spanish well, et cetera, et cetera. These are all ideologies that really just distract us from our own oppression, from the fact that we're not even supposed to be speaking Spanish in the first place. It was a language that was violently forced on us, and rather than competing and aiming to speak in so-called standard or correct Spanish, we should now embrace the different forms it has taken in the different regions based on the different Afro-Indigenous elements that survived through the Spanish language spoken by our ancestors in each of these regions. I enter this work and this research from a very personal place, and I want to share that with you. I think it's always important for researchers, academics to share from their personal place, their positionality. So here are some pictures of me and my students when I was a bilingual teacher. During a parent-teacher conference, my second year as a New York City dual language bilingual teacher, a parent who recently moved from Venezuela thought she was complimenting me by letting me know that I speak Spanish well. She explained that she was worried about me at the beginning of the school year because her other child's Dominican teacher didn't speak el español correcto. I chuckled and I reassured her. Dominicans speak bad Spanish, I thought, so I should be proud. I was proud. And I let that pride overpower the discomfort I felt deep in my soul, the pain and humiliation that were too deep for me to acknowledge, the linguistic wound that I felt opening. Are we really going to compete over who's linguistically colonized best? And I quote Gloria Ansaldúa. She says, if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Several theoretical frameworks guide my work. I won't get too theoretical here, but I think that specifically the racial linguistic perspective has helped me understand oppressive beliefs around language and race a lot in the past few years, and has guided a lot of my research work in the PhD program, as well as my work with teachers in classrooms. And I want to share some of that with you today. So first, I'll explain a bit about racial linguistics. So I use a racial linguistic lens to understand all these concepts. This is a theoretical lens that was presented by Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa in 2015, and it merges critical theories of race and language to examine the ways in which language and race are and have always been co-constructed and are therefore very intricately interrelated. So they highlight how historically racialized perceptions of speakers influence how others interpret the way that they speak. And likewise, ideologies or beliefs about language influence how people are ethnicized or racialized. In other words, because certain language practices are stereotypically perceived to be representative of specific ethnic and racial categories, there are social and institutional expectations for individuals to look like a language or to sound like a race, which is something that Jonathan Rosa talks about in his book about racial linguistic ideologies and the learning of Latinidad. For example, some of you have probably had to navigate people being surprised that you speak Spanish, as one of you mentioned in the chat, because maybe you don't quote unquote look like the race or the ethnicity. Or I'm sure many of you are expected to speak Spanish and or to be expected to be bilingual, right? These expectations totally disregard our indigeneity, right? Disregarding that many communities speak an indigenous language first before Spanish, right? Many people speak Mixteco, Zapote, Garifuna, Nahuatl, and many, many other indigenous languages that thankfully have been preserved and are still very much alive. Still, many of us are expected, if we are quote unquote Latino, to speak Spanish, right? And or to be bilingual, which that expectation disregards our colonial histories and realities, that many people had the border crossed them, for example, in the Southwest. And many people had their languages stripped from them just a generation ago. People here, even students here in New York City, were punished and hit, right, just for speaking their language in school. So a lot of these expectations, racial linguistic ideologies, the racial linguistic lens helps us understand these expectations. Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, with this racial linguistic perspective, also highlight that this idea of a standard language is racialized. And as I mentioned earlier, that what's considered standard, what's standardized, is usually the language of people in power. And there's a lot of whiteness behind that. Unfortunately, they explain that many of us, even if we're not white, we take on this white listening ear, or we become these white listening subjects, and we police each other, listening for what's correct Spanish, what's correct English, what's appropriate, right? And the work I do is working with teachers to help them see how they might be doing that with their students and taking deficit lenses, and not hearing what's there, the actual natural way of languaging, but rather they're looking for this correctness or appropriateness, right? Because this white listening ear regularly perceives the dynamic language practices of communities of color as deficient, thinking that some of us do not speak or not balanced bilingual, for example, we don't speak academic Spanish, or things like that, that are just intricately come from these racist ideologies. And because people of color are seen as linguistically deficient, even when they produce standard white English, it doesn't matter, as April Baker Bell points out, and Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores continue to write about, that it doesn't matter if us Black and brown people, for example, learn to speak in a quote unquote white way, because we are still going to be discriminated, right? April Baker Bell in her book talks about the fact that all of these Black youth that have been killed, mostly by police, they spoke quote unquote appropriate white English, and asking like, please don't shoot, right? Things like that before they were killed. So does it really make a difference for us to try to compete and be closer to this proximity of whiteness, as we inherit and take on this listening white ear, right? Even though we are still going to be seen as linguistically deficient. There are many detriments of these racial linguistic ideologies. For example, securing housing. I'm sure some of you have heard of studies that were done years ago by Baugh and Purnell, just calling for different housing ads and speaking with different accents. And of course, the people who were heard to sound Black or Latino were not, they weren't showed any apartment. Meanwhile, if you called and you sounded white, quote unquote, then the apartment was shown to you. So there are housing ramifications, employment ramifications as well, which several scholars have written about, where they talk about the different ways that Spanish speakers are exploited in the job, but also have been fired for speaking Spanish in the job. Ironically, people who were hired for being able to speak Spanish, even though they're hired and they're abused because they're not paid more for that language labor. But contradictorily, those people that were hired for speaking Spanish were also fired for speaking Spanish, even during their lunch, right? So things like that. And then just deficit narratives that go around in schools and beyond schools, of people being semi-lingual, for example, that you're not fully lingual, or being a languageless, which Rosa also speaks about. students who are seen as like not acquiring or learning the standard English or standard Spanish enough, and they're considered like semi-lingual languageless, or nilingües, which is a word in the a play on the Spanish word bilingüe, but not even lingual, which unfortunately I observed, and my colleagues and I, Seltzer, and I wrote about in an article about teachers who were looking at the kindergartners and saying, oh, those kids are nilingües, they're not even lingual, right? Because they're not strong in Spanish or English, totally disregarding that these kids have survived 5 years being able to communicate in some way at home and have gotten to this point in their lives. So it's important to see the linguistic features that they are bringing in and the strengths they're bringing in, not just listening, right? That by listening ear, listening for that standard appropriate language. And this idea of a word gap, that's really, that has circulated and has been believed by many educators across the nation. The idea that Black and Brown and low-income students come into pre-K with something like 30 million less vocabulary words than other students. So very harmful ideologies. In schools, these are perpetuated and they permeate school settings. So for example, and Wiley points this out, the schools have been the principal instruments in promoting a consensus regarding the alleged superiority of standardized languages. This idea of standard language has served as a medium for maintaining deep-rooted power dynamics. And this has been for years, right? With Indian boarding schools, which now we're hearing more about, thankfully, people are becoming more aware of that disgusting history, where here in the US and in Canada, for example, and I know some students were, indigenous folks were brought from Puerto Rico to schools here, that the motive was to kill the Indian, save the man, right? So to strip the Indian out of the being, the person, the spirituality, cut the hair, the language, right? And they knew that for preventing them from speaking the language would be huge, because this language is such an intricate part of who we are. Excuse me. And over history, many English-only education policies across the country have been influenced by these racial linguistic ideologies, banning Ebonics in schools, right? African-American English, this fear of anything that's not the standardized dominant version of a language, right, of English. And racial linguistic ideologies also shape this idea of what's considered academic language, which you as college students, I'm sure, are grappling with now, right? What kind of language can I use when I write this academic paper? Why do I have to change the natural way I'm used to writing, or can I just write the way I grew up writing? And if you do write the way that you grew up writing, speaking, then that's a privilege, right? That's a privilege you're bringing in, where many of us, and I say us, because even as a PhD student, I'm still grappling with like, how much whiteness do I have to put on for this academic paper, for this dissertation, for example, and dismantling that and trying to decolonize that. But this idea of what we've been taught is academic language. It stems from whiteness, right? What's seen as appropriate. And these are measured in school accountability systems that aim to close the achievement gap by measuring cultural linguistic standards that look a certain way, and they're the dominant white standards, right? Unfortunately, there are many teachers, and many studies have done of teachers who take on this white listening ear, take on these racial linguistic ideologies, and their goal, they aim to replace students' language, right? There are many studies in English, but some in Spanish, I'll point out, are seen below. For example, this high school teacher in Uptown Manhattan, New York City, one of the students describes that their Spanish teachers try to teach us proper Spanish, but they use us to help the other, often white middle class students. When we do speak, they interrupt us and correct us. They make us repeat everything, right? And this is the experience of a lot of us who take Spanish as a foreign language in high school, where our Spanish isn't seen as appropriate or correct, yet we might be used to teach the other students who are learning the language, right? Another teacher, elementary school bilingual teacher, told her students in one study, así no se habla, así no habla la gente educada. That's not how educated people speak, when the students had different words, when they would say elevador instead of ascensor, for example, right, for elevator. So just teaching students to erase their natural way of speaking, the way that their ancestors, their abuelitas, their moms taught them to speak, and teaching them that's inferior, that's a deficit, don't speak like that. That's not how educated people speak. So imagine the emotional effects that has on someone. And very young kids who are learning this, right, who how we're being taught, like, this isn't the correct way to speak, right? And again, I want to bring it back to my personal experience, because this isn't something I'm disconnected from. This is from my childhood. You can see some pictures here from my childhood. The language that sounds so wrong to so many is a beautiful, creative, diasporic language of resistance and remembrance. It's a resistance of our African and indigenous ancestors who resisted and remembered some of their way of being and preserved that in the language. As a first-generation Dominican New Yorker and a former English language learner in New York City public schools, I'm grateful for the Black and Brown advocates who fought for linguistically sustaining schools before me. Thanks to their efforts, I was able to attend bilingual Head Start and kindergarten as a child. Nonetheless, it must have been then that I started to learn the correct way of labeling the world around me. I learned that una mata, for example, was actually a tree or un árbol, and an orange was not a china, but a naranja, which is also a word for the color, not mamey, as my grandma had taught me. Un cambumbo es una cubeta, un cubo, or bucket. I must have caught on to the dominant Spanish and English ways quickly, because I was placed in an English monolingual classroom for first grade. Most of the lessons that we get on hierarchical language ideologies are implicit. And all the TV we watch at home centered livestreamed Spanish, deviating from it only when mocking and further marginalized characters like La India Maria. I also observed how my mom and my grandma often changed the way they spoke Spanish around others, making sure to pronounce all the S's and exclude terms that were bien dominicano or too plebe. So around others, I too tried my best to speak like noticiero anchors and novela actresses, like the white protagonistas, of course, not the Black and brown sirvientas. While nighttime television modeled the correct way to speak English, school was now teaching me the correct way to speak Spanish. School was now teaching me the correct way to speak English. And I invoke Gloria Saldúa again, who writes a lot about this, and I relate to her writing a lot. Deslenguadas, somos el español deficiente. We are your linguistic nightmare, your linguistic aberration, your linguistic mestizaje, the subject of your burla. Racially, culturally, and linguistically, somos huérfanos. We speak an orphan tongue. I won't get too much into all the different research articles that I've have researched, but here are some that talk about the racialized stigmatization of Dominican Spanish specifically, which is something I'm looking at now in my study amongst Latinos. So several studies have been done that interview and survey quote unquote Latinos across the US, and people have said things like los dominicanos hablan feo, Dominicans speak ugly. Dominicans were rated as the least correct and the least pleasant by Cubans in Miami in a study by Alfaraz, who asked her to have student participants to rank 21 different ways of speaking Spanish from different countries. Dominicans were at the very bottom, Puerto Ricans above that. And as you can imagine, it goes, as the author mentioned, from the blackest countries to the brownest, and the white ones are on top. The ones that are perceived to be white, perceived to be black, right? And in lexical level in New York City, there was a rejection of Dominican-specific terms. So these researchers went around New York City asking different terms that they prefer, the Dominican terms were rejected most. And unfortunately, Dominicans experienced more linguistic insecurity than other linguistic groups in several studies that were done. So, which makes sense that we ourselves, as you saw in the anecdote I shared in the beginning, we internalize the fact that we speak the worst Spanish, or we speak incorrectly, because that's what's always been taught to us, right? And Lippy Green makes a great point that linguistic domination depends on racialized ideology becoming deeply entrenched in us, right? This mystification message is so strong that many people really believe that they don't speak their own language well, unfortunately. Dominicans in another study also stated that their Spanish should not be taught in schools because it is bad or incorrect. And a lot of Dominicans tend to idolize the way Spanish people speak. The Spanish people, someone said, I like the way that Spaniards speak. They have a better way from speaking than us, better form of speaking than us. We Dominicans have the problem of speaking with the orthographical errors, said someone interviewed by Toribio. Here, people speak with orthographical errors, not merely write it, but speak it too. And someone else, Dominicans don't speak Spanish well. So this is very common. It's nothing new. And this is why now in my work, I work with bilingual teachers at the very early stage in elementary school to help dismantle this colonial racist ideologies of what's considered correct, proper, standard Spanish in a dual language setting where students are learning English and Spanish. They're learning math, reading, writing, all subject areas in reading in English and Spanish as a way to preserve their home language, right? So I'm going in and interrogating that, and I just finished collecting data recently, so I don't have any findings to share with you yet. But what I'm looking at is thinking of, I interviewed students to think about what they think about Dominican Spanish and how they experience these ideologies themselves as 8 and 9-year-old Dominican, right? The goal is for them and for teachers to use this data, educators to use this data to help teachers dismantle and counter these ideologies early on, starting in elementary school. So as students like me and myself, as a young student, to see that the Spanish spoken by Dominicans, for example, is a reflection of our Taino, our indigenous and African ancestors' resistance and survival, right? There's so many words that have survived all of the genocide, the colonization, all the violence that you can see in the upper right corner, words that we still use in Spanish today that are Taino, for example, right? And our ancestral legacies are alive and they live through us and through our spirituality, our music, our foods, our natural medicines, and the language varieties. And this, I focus on Dominican, but they're in the coast of Colombia and parts of Ecuador, like everywhere. It's a reflection of our Black and brown ancestors who went through so much. And this is one way that the resistance through the tongue, right, demonstrates the survival of their ways of being. It's our legacies. The language that sounds so wrong to so many is a beautiful, creative, diasporic language of resistance and remembrance. I invoke Bell Hooks, who saw this. She said, there exists a counter language. While it may resemble in the ways resemble in ways the colonizer's tongue, it has undergone a transformation. It has been irrevocably changed. The necessity of a resistance that is sustained by remembrance of the past, which includes recollections of broken tongues, giving us ways to speak and that decolonize our minds, our very beings. Our indigenous and African ancestors lived through us. They're present in every aspect of our experience, our knowledge, our food, our art, our spirituality, our medicine, our language, and our survival. They live through our tongues. Even after a century of violence, oppressions, we can hear our ancestors' voices using the master's words, yet resisting being stripped of their identities, continuing to move with their own currents, transforming our language with words that make me laugh, words that make me cringe. This creative resistance is what the oppressors consider bad Spanish. The language that sounds so wrong to so many is a beautiful, creative, diasporic language of resistance and remembrance. It is the language through which I make sense of this world. It is a West African Arawakan Spanish. Y el mío con un chin de Nueva York. I wanted to share a bit of my little narrative I wrote there. Lastly, I want to share some of the ways that I have helped teachers and worked with educators to disrupt racial linguistic ideologies in schools, right? These dominant ideologies that tell us that that we start from this white supremacist position of monolingualism is the norm. It's a neutral starting point, although many people are multilingual from the time they're born, right? They're born there as toddlers, they become multilingual. So it's not like you speak one language first and the other. And there's this idea that this proper standard version of a language exists or is a superior, right? So how do we counter that in schools? Well, one way that I have worked with teachers to do this as a research assistant who also provides as a consultant and provides professional development in different schools is that we talk about a translanguaging perspective. A translanguaging perspective takes on this idea that multilinguals have one complex and dynamic linguistic repertoire. We don't have a part of our brain that's Spanish, part of our brain that's English. It's just one language system, right? And we cannot expect students to shut down one part of their brain, right? It's one language system, and we must fully recognize that, validate all of the features in that language system, and leverage that, use that to help them understand academic content, regardless of what society says or school says is academic, right? We need to invite the whole child and build on students' entire linguistic identities. Schools must critically, so I argue that schools must critically address and counter hegemonic language ideologies. And to do this, we need to historicize non-dominant ways of being. Explain to students, why is it Dominican Spanish sounds different than Mexican Spanish? And even even regionally, the north of DR, why does it sound different than the south? And, you know, thinking about Puebla versus Veracruz and things like that, right? To re-envision the margins as a place of transformative resistance. Oops. These are examples of, these are some fourth graders. They had read some of these books that were very reflective of their culture and their background, and they were bilingual, and some of them were in one language, but they used translanguaging where the author went back and forth with different languages. So they were analyzing the different ways that and reasons that authors translanguage, right? Sometimes it's because it's dialogue and they need to show exactly what the characters said, right? They can't say mommy said this in English, where no, mommy only speaks Spanish. Sometimes it's to show their background, their culture and language, sometimes it's to show humor, et cetera, et cetera. And then they were encouraged to translanguage in their own essays and narrative. These are some third graders going around their community to analyze language. And one powerful moment was this sign in front of a Chinese food restaurant that said, buscamos un delibrista. And they were there saying, you know, they were contemplating for a while, is it English, is it Spanish? Because delibrista comes from delivery and ista comes from the Spanish, right? So we're looking for a delibrista. And then they said, you know what? It's the Spanish from Washington Heights, from their neighborhood in northern Manhattan, which is very predominantly Dominican, very Latino, Hispanic neighborhood, right? Quote, unquote. But they were like, that's the Spanish, that's the language we use here. So normalizing things like that and not seeing as deficient. And doing things like these language maps that these third graders did, where students would analyze the different ways they use their languages. So this student, and we're invited and celebrate, invited to talk about the indigenous languages at home as well, which is often stigmatized and totally ignored in classrooms, right? So this student talked about the different way they used English with friends and schools, the family. Some students even talked about they speak different languages with their pets. And just quickly, I'm looking at the time, but these are examples, many different examples of different classrooms where teachers were recentering the marginalized language practices, not just Spanish, of course, all the languages that exist in your room you should send a message as a teacher that they are just as important as every other language, right? So here you have a teacher, this is good morning in all the languages in the room and the pronunciation of it, and different word walls in different languages, the different languages spoken at home, and this cute little kindergarten, mi familia dice, my family says quilt, with the grandparents and the expressions they say. And of course, at 5 years old, the students are learning, don't translate what your grandma or grandpa says, say it in Hebrew, say it in Spanish, whatever they say, that's what you're writing here, right? That we need to be genuine, and all languages are just as valid. So before I end, I wanted to direct you, if you are interested, I know this is a lot that I packed into these 40 minutes, but if you're interested in learning more, reading more, there are several publications that I have written on the topic. And most importantly, I think what's most engaging and entertaining are videos that I actually have created and edited and uploaded to the CUNY NYSIB website. CUNY stands for City University of New York, as you know, as SUNY students, but the NYSIB is New York State Initiative on Emerging Bilinguals, and it's an initiative that I was a part of for many years. It now ended, the grant ended, but you can actually see videos of me and my fourth graders there from when I was in the classroom years ago, and some videos of, for example, the third and fourth graders that I showed you navigating, walking through the community and interviewing folks in the community and things like that, and lots of other resources and things about trans language. So thank you so much, mil gracias, and I am open to questions now in the last few minutes that we have.
Thank you so much, Gladys. Really fascinating talk. And there's been a lot of comments, questions in the chat function, and we can try to get to as many of them as we can in the time remaining. But I also want to introduce to the audience that Professor Jordan Bell from our English department is also here. So for all our audience who may know him directly or indirectly. Really interesting talk. I think pretty much so many people can relate to the experiences around language, particularly people who speak more than one language in the United States can certainly relate to much of that. And for many English speakers who perhaps had the privilege of not having to think about these issues as much, they certainly had an opportunity to reflect a little more on that as well here today. Just some of the interesting comments that are in the chat from various viewers. Let's see, Jasmine Floyd, who's a student of mine actually, noted, I also experience issues similar to Samantha because my dad is Black and my mom is Puerto Rican. Therefore, I am darker than what people believe I should be as a Hispanic, and disregard that I do classify not only as African American, but Latina as well. And so certainly she sees that there are a lot of assumptions associated with place of origin or nationality along the lines of race or racial lines, which obviously are problematic, and she's, from her experience, noticing that. Do you want to add anything to Jasmine's comment, Gladys or Jordan?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, right? And it definitely relates to what we were talking about, these expectations that are placed on us and how we have to navigate these expectations. And, as we work to decolonize and think about, where these come from and how to navigate them, it's important to think about those things and to think about the ramifications and the consequences of, how do I respond to that, and also where they come from, and being knowledgeable about where these ideas come from and how language and race intersect, right?
And of course, social class too, which you also raised, right? There are also assumptions about social class and propriety around language, right? And how if you don't speak a certain standard type of language, there are assumptions about what social class position you have in society. And of course, there are a lot of prejudice associated with social class position as well, which also often intersect with race and other identities, which is important to consider. Also, just a question I want to, just for clarification purposes, Gladys, you mentioned the term decolonize a few times. Could you define that for our viewers?
Yes, that's a great question. So there are many definitions of decolonizing. I think I'm actually leaning towards, it's interesting because I told myself I would use anti-colonial and decolonial, because a lot of people think decolonial and they think land back, but I think decolonizing is just us being aware of all of the things that colonialism has, the consequences that colonialism has that we've inherited, and all the things that we've been left with, the whiteness, right? Even if we're not white, but even this idea of like what's considered academic language, and how just going back to our indigenous ways of being, right? The way we relate with the earth, the way we relate with our plant and animal relatives, the way we just interact with one another, removing ourselves. And we can't talk about, I don't think, Mehmet, we can talk about class or capitalism without talking about race, right? So even the way we live, our day-to-day, being. So when I think of decolonizing, it's a huge umbrella. And being anti-colonial is trying to, as much as possible, move away from these ways of being that are harmful for us, right? And that we are very, most of us, I mean, we're in a university, right? This is a white institution. I'm getting my PhD. I'm complicit in this, the whiteness there. So just navigating that in a way, thinking about different ways, different details of like, how can I be in this space? I'm complicit, but also do this in an anti-colonial way, right? And critique what I'm doing, and even critique and question myself, right?
So thank you for just like raising awareness to those tensions that so many of us are confronted with, where on one side we're working towards like really pronouncing our own identities and getting away from some of these colonizing practices, but on the other side, just realizing that we have to operate within these systems and structures that are out there that have been colonized or have been steeped in other ways of being that may not resonate with us. So my question is actually built upon the last student comment, where she was talking about her Latina identity as well as her Black identity, and then this old concept of decolonization. So I understand that a lot of colonizing practices don't benefit us in the long run. So I'm curious, what can we start to pivot to? And I'm specifically thinking of like Latinx or Latina folks and across the diaspora. What can they pivot to as like new types of ways to identify that don't reproduce or reinforce this colonization? Because just like you said, like Latin in and of itself can be problematic.
Right, yeah. And going back to what you said, Jordan, of like these tensions, right? Because I have this conversation a lot with my partner who does all of this anti-colonial decolonizing work. She's Taína. She's Taíno from Boriquén, and she does a lot of work of like, I'm indigenous. And I tell her like, well, this is in my work, I have this umbrella term of Latinx, right? Because unfortunately, we do have this similarity of like, we were colonized by Spain, right? But now, and there are so many differences between me and even her who's Boricua, right? Even though there are a lot of similarities, me and a quote unquote Latina from Honduras who's Garifuna versus someone from Honduras who's not Garifuna, right? So I think that it's the way we can move towards it's just being very specific about who we are, right? So even in the beginning, it was a conscious decision to say I am a Dominican New Yorker, but I am on Lenape land and what's now considered New York City. My parents are from Quisqueya, that's the indigenous Taino word for the Dominican Republic, right? Being very specific about that. And I tried to move away from calling myself Latina because of what I mentioned before, but also understanding that there is a similarity because we've been, for the last few decades, we have been convinced that we are Latinx, right? That we are under this umbrella and we have so many things in common, not just the Spanish language, but a lot of cultural things that, it's easy for me to say like, oh, me and my Latinos, things like that. But for me I think it's about being conscious and making that conscious decision and choice of words of like, this is who I am, but also, yes, we share many things in common. And also being mindful of how that term was used for capitalist reasons, right? For us, Goya, Univision, right? So it's like, oh, come, listen, you're all the same. Here are these beans, and right. So being very aware of that, and then just moving towards just saying like, no, I'm indigenous, I'm mixed indigenous, African, European, I have European colonizer blood, I have African blood from my ancestors were enslaved, and I am Taino from the Dominican Republic, what's not considered the Dominican Republic, right? It's a mouthful, right? But if we're talking about decolonizing, then I think that's where we're moving towards. And I think saying also something that's important to say for, I believe her name's Samantha, that, you know, when we think about race and ethnicity, oftentimes people want to separate it. But I think it's important to name that you can Afro-Indigenous, right? So Boricua from Boriquen, which is now considered Puerto Rico, and you can be Black, African-American from descendant of people who were enslaved and brought here to what's now the US, right? So that there's that intersection of race and the history of your ancestors. And a lot of times we're taught to separate that, and that's why people find themselves questioning, well, people think I'm Black, but I'm actually Puerto Rican. It's like, can't you be both? You are both, right? Because we live in a society where you're seen as Black, but you still may have ancestry from Puerto Rico, and you may have some European blood, right? But unfortunately, that's how we're categorized into these racial boxes, right?
Yeah, really good points. And awareness, I think, is a key point that you raised about awareness about the experiences and histories of so many different peoples. And instead of trying to erase them, being mindful of them, right? Because we don't want to alienate, obviously, people, but especially as educators, we don't want to alienate our students and then think about, you know, what are the long-term consequences of alienating our students, especially at young ages, right? What that means for the trajectory of their lives, of course. Moving further, Emily McNamara adds, would it help break the stereotype against Spanish-speaking individuals, as well as benefit those children if Spanish was taught earlier in education, such as in elementary school?
Yeah, so if I understood the question correctly, I think that the dual language bilingual programs, which is where I taught and where I'm doing my research, the purpose of those programs is for students to learn to maintain their home language if it's Spanish, while learning English and learning the content areas in both languages. So like one day the students will learn in English, the next day they'll learn in Spanish. And the idea is that they'll learn like terms for biology, for math in Spanish, and also in English. Unfortunately, as a side note, these programs have been commodified by a lot of middle-class white folks who want their students to be bilingual, want their children to be bilingual. So they go in there from kindergarten, and by 5th grade, they're bilingual and biliterate, right? Although these programs are a result of activists and community fights and struggles for culturally and linguistically sustaining schooling, right? But that's the idea behind that, right? So what I'm saying with my research, though, is that I'm all for dual language programs, particularly for students who speak Spanish at home, to preserve that part of their identity and to develop it, right? To develop the bilingualism and biliteracy. However, we need to be more critical. So students that are Dominican, for example, aren't being taught that the way they speak Spanish at home is wrong, and that they need to fix their Spanish, and oftentimes speak the English that they're picking up in their communities, and they're saying, nope, don't speak that African-American English, for example, right? That we need to take a critical stance, a critical lens as educators in those programs to make sure we're fully validating the full child, right? The whole child. And in addition to that we are not disregarding the indigenous languages that historically in what are considered Latin American countries now have been totally stigmatized, and many people are even afraid to share that, you know, they speak those languages at home. There are many families who won't tell you that they speak Mixteco, Zapotec at home because of different societal pressures, right? So as educators, it's important to make sure that we are aware of that, and that we don't say English and Spanish only, standard English, standard Spanish only, but that we really welcome the full child and their language practices of their community.
Thank you. Also, just considering that so many people from, let's say, Mexico are from indigenous communities may not even speak Spanish, right? They come to the United States as immigrant communities, not knowing Spanish even, right? They speak Mexica, so for example, and so you know, if the perhaps lack of awareness of the different regional groups, of the complexities of the populations throughout Mexico, makes lack of awareness can make them invisible, right? And of their experiences. And as educators, if we want to serve those communities, I think we have to develop, of course, that awareness. I think your talk raises so many other important points, I think, for sociological reasons that I would love to touch on more, of course, but about power and how power works. We often associate power with politics, people in government and so on, but power translates into, and when we're talking about decolonize, into everyday behaviors, right? Everyday forms of interactions, everyday assumptions that people make about you, which then shape the interactions that we have, right? The treatment, how we treat each other. And so behavior on a daily basis is reflective of power, right? The dominant groups who get to define, what is the standard, what is proper, what's not proper, what's beautiful, what's not beautiful, right? The aesthetics, right? And so we have to be mindful of how power translates to, all everyday forms of interactions, and therefore how, inequality, the inequities in our societies are therefore reproduced on a daily basis, right? I think that's important to emphasize. And I think that this talk, brings that out very effectively. Other comments. Alexis Bass, who's also a student of mine, wanted to thank you for the talk. As someone who is going into early childhood education, you have brought up a lot of good points to keep in mind. So thank you, she says. Kenny Matthews points out, I think, an astute point. As my girlfriend taught me from her phonetics class, there isn't any, quote, proper dialect of English. It's purely based on what is considered the norm in your region, right? So I thank you, Kenny, for that comment. From that perspective, it's pretty upsetting that many Spanish-speaking children are sort of taught that the way they speak is, quote, wrong, close quote, to the point of them becoming insecure about it at such a young age, he adds. So do you want to respond or?
Yeah, and I'm still in the process of analyzing the data I collected, interviewing these 8 and 9-year-olds, but it's the internalized oppression, right, that I experienced, as I shared with some of my anecdotes, and that I witnessed many of my students had as a 4th grade teacher, and now working with teachers and future teachers and at the college level. It's very common. They even I have adult students who are opening their eyes oh yeah, I never thought about, where did this idea come from? And I've always thought this, and it's so wrong. And I internalize this myself. It's very common to internalize these inferior views of ourselves, sadly, right? But it has also to do with what you mentioned, racism, power, right? All of these dynamics that are so strong that, yeah, we come to internalize them ourselves, unfortunately.
And Jasmine Floyd finally again wants to give just a comment. I love what you do in these schools. I wish I had access to someone like you in school at that age, she writes.
Thank you, Jasmine. I also do. I wish I had an educator, and that's why I do what I do working with teachers now. I left the classroom about 6 years ago now, and it was because I wanted to work with teachers. And the more I open my eyes to things and how messed up things are, the more I want to inspire teachers and help them see, what I see now, and to create classrooms that are more inviting and sustain and validate students' full linguistic selves and full identities.
Good. Thank you. Well, that's it for the comment section. Jordan, do you want to add any further comments or questions before we close out?
Really? I just want to shout Gladys for coming through and just sharing her dopeness and brilliance with the rest of us, and really just reaffirming what language and identity and how we think about it. And just so reaffirming identities and letting folks know that, it's all right to be you. You don't need to speak standard academic English. You don't need to speak standard Spanish. You can rep you in ways that you find beautiful and that resonate with you in the community that you're from. And that's just something that just makes me smile inside. And just like Gladys, I just can't wait till the next time I get to connect with you, and you already know, nothing but love.
Thank you, Jordan. I love connecting with you too. Thank you so much for the invitation.
And Gladys, again, thank you so much for the talk. Really fascinating. I think it gives a lot of food for thought for our community, of course, as educators, and of course for our students. So again, thank you, and hopefully we can bring you back at some future date for further discussions and talks. So again, thank you. And just to close out, please check out the events for future events for Hispanic Heritage Month. There are almost, I think there's an event every week until the end of October. So please check that out. Next Thursday, artist Aurelio del Muro is going to talk about how art finds its inspiration, and specifically, we're going to look at the poetry of Puerto Rican poet Julia de Burgos. And reading some of her poetry, we're going to visualize, and then we're going to have the opportunity to paint following that. So please, it'll be collective artwork. So there's something for everyone. So this next event, next Thursday, September 22nd, will be from 12:30 to 1:45 in Dutchess Hall 101. We hope to see you there. And please check out all the events. There's really something for everyone. If you like music and dance, if you like, again, provocative discussions and talks about education, about race, about language, about politics, there's that. If you're into filmmaking, there's going to be presentations of documentary shorts by a filmmaker, Fernando Valencia. Please check it out. There's really something for everyone. And so we hope that you're there and you'll share with us in some of the interesting work that our presenters do. So please check them out. Please come. We hope to see you there. Thank you. So goodbye,
everyone for coming.
So thank you, Gladys. Oh, bye.